Hello YouTube and welcome to an all new Elder Scrolls lore video. Today we're talking about the Night of Green Fire, a tragic event set in the early 4th era. That said, this won't be a very long video, so let's immediately get into it. So, the Night of Green Fire. To truly understand what happened that night in the year 42 of the 4th era in Hammerfell in the city of Sentinel, we have to go back a few decades, to the year 1 of the 4th era in the Somerset Isles. In that year, the Oblivion Crisis ended by the hands of Martin Septim and the Hero of Kvatch, which forms the basis for the story of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. However, the Oblivion Crisis had already done significant damage to Tamriel at that point and had brought devastation to almost every province of Tamriel. The Somerset Isles in particular are said to have been hit really hard by its effects, with many of their cities overrun and only a select few bastions across the land, with the Crystal Tower being the main one, still holding out against the waves of the Daedra. But even those last bastions eventually started falling, with the Crystal Tower eventually also being overrun. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, all the Daedra disappeared, leaving the High Elves grateful but very confused as to why the crisis had suddenly ended. Nobody knew what had happened. Martin's sacrifice, the end of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, was just minutes ago and was thousands of miles away, and no real news of his sacrifice would reach the Somerset Isles for quite some time. But one faction saw an opportunity, the Thalmor. The Thalmor, which has long been a minority, extremist, elvish supremacist faction in the Somerset Isles, claimed that it had been them who had ended the crisis. They claimed that they had worked subtle magics in order to end the crisis and that the High Elves should be grateful to them. This worked, because in all the confusion the High Elves really believed that their supposed saviors were the Thalmor. And having the end of the Oblivion Crisis attributed to them, the Thalmor suddenly gained massively in popularity in the Somerset Isles. Slowly but steadily, over the next 10 years, they were to get more and more popular in the Somerset Isles, apparently doing real good for the Somerset Isles in these years, helping the people rebuild and protecting the people against all kind of things, while also keeping to remind them that they were the ones that ended the Oblivion Crisis, and absolutely not Martin. All good and sweet, but there were some troubling signs as well. As they became more and more influential, the Thalmor started to publicly discredit those who were working with the Imperial government, turning their followers against the Empire, which was now led by the High Chancellor Orcato. And also they started turning their followers on those who knew what really happened at the end of the Oblivion Crisis, trying to discredit them as much as possible. After a while, the Thalmor had enough influence to start suddenly exiling people from the Isles whom they didn't agree with. Even former heroes of the High Elves would see their population turn on them and see themselves forced into exile, with those heroes often ending up in mysterious deaths surrounding their exile. But for all their influence, the Thalmor weren't yet the official rulers of the Somerset Isles. That is, until High Chancellor Orcato of the Empire was assassinated and all of the Empire was plunged into chaos. The Thalmor then used this chaos to overthrow the kings and queens of the Somerset Isles, and with their popularity among the population being so strong, most of the Somerset population immediately accepted the Thalmor as their new leaders. Once in power, the Thalmor immediately began with a rule of fear and intimidation against those who didn't agree with them. Pogroms were held against all non-Altmer in the Somerset Isles, with many killed or fled before the Thalmor could reach them. The Thalmor then also invaded Valenwood, committing coups in all the major areas, deposing of the Imperial-controlled governments and installing their own, while quickly using their forces to kill off any Imperial troops in the region. They then formed a new country, the Altmerry Dominion, consisting of the Somerset Isles and Valenwood. In this new country, any dissent was clamped down upon by the Thalmor violently. Anyone who did not agree with their policies or was suspected of not agreeing would find themselves denounced and killed off. In their new territory of Valenwood, there were apparently very big rebellions, with the rebels being assisted by the Imperial Penitus Oculatus, sort of the security force of the Empire. I made a video on them a while back, so watch that if you want to know more about them. But those rebellions were crushed time and time again, with the Thalmor purging the province of their opponents, killing off countless Bosmer, with several more purges across the entire province taking place over the years to come. Such a repressive regime was obviously not to the liking of many, as large streams of refugees started fleeing from Valenwood and the Somerset Isles to the Empire. Across the Empire, many Altmeri refugees settled, but if they assumed that they had become free of the Thalmor terror by fleeing to the Empire, they were wrong. The Thalmor employed a vast network of assassins all across the Empire to kill the most vocal of those in exile, with anyone trying to turn the Empire against the Thalmor being assassinated quickly and painfully. They also employed harassment groups. According to the Elder Scrolls novel The Infernal City, Altmer and Bosmer refugees were harassed all across the Empire by those groups and by the Thalmor. But by far the worst incident that we know of was the Night of Green Fire. You see, due to its geographical position, it's said that the Gold Coast of Cyrodiil and the coastal cities of Hammerfell bared the most of the refugees from the Somerset Isles and Valenwood. The city of Sentinel in Hammerfell even had its own large refugee quarters, where hundreds if not thousands of refugees from the Somerset Isles were living in exile by the grace and protection of the Empire. Supposedly more cities had these kind of refugee quarters. However, in secret, a large group of Thalmor mages had infiltrated the city of Sentinel in year 42 of the 4th era. Under the cover of darkness they infiltrated, and Legate Fastendale of the Empire recounts that day evil seemed to hang in the air above Sentinel. And he was right, as that very night an immense explosion of green fire took place in the refugee quarter of the city, taking everyone by surprise. Hundreds of refugees likely died in an instant, and within seconds those refugees which had survived the massive green explosion started fighting back with magic of their own, the refugee quarter lighting up in the eerie light of magical combat. That night, not many would survive. The Imperial garrison of the city immediately mobilized fully and rushed to the scene in order to try and save the refugees, but the evil was long since done, as the entire refugee quarter had been turned to a smoking ruin. All refugees had been killed, who had all fled from the Thalmor hoping to be safe in the Empire, with all they found being their own deaths. That was the Night of Green Fire, the biggest action against refugees within the Empire by the Thalmor that we at least know about. For something so grand scale and so daring, with basically a public attack on one of the Empire's city's quarters, they must have had some influential Thalmor critics in that refugee quarter of Sentinel, or perhaps the Thalmor simply wanted to make an example for other refugee quarters or other refugees. But this little story definitely fits within those sort of small Hammerfell lore bits that we know about from Skyrim, which lead me to believe that we'll see Hammerfell in the Elder Scrolls 6, and perhaps these sort of refugee quarters also in the Elder Scrolls 6. Perhaps there will be even some references to this night in some quests. Anyway, that was today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something, and if you did, consider returning for the next Elder Scrolls lore video, as I make them almost every week. And with that behind us, allow me to thank my top Patreon supporters: Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polarized Putin, Athena Hyotis, Andrew Jordan, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Sarah Mikal, and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel can stay alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.